Good afternoon. My job in the next 25 to 30 minutes is to summarize the extended half-life and put a global perspective into the summary. These are my disclosures. So I will go into the rationale for the development of extended half-life products and give an overview of the technologies and perhaps summarize, and in this particular Congress you would have heard about the extended half-life, summarize their clinical profile from the clinical trial perspective, and also speculate on some of the strategies that may maximize their impact, particularly in the resource constraint settings, and provide some concluding remarks. Just to remind you that for this audience is no surprise, prophylaxis is the optimum care of patients with hemophilia, and essentially the rationale for that is to take patients that have got mild or moderate disease and convert them to, patients that have got severe disease and convert them to mild or moderate phenotype, which obviously bleed less. There are many benefits of prophylaxis. Some of these are listed here. This is not an exhaustive list. They include reduction in bleeding rates. They include, as a result of the reduction in bleeding rate, of course, the joint damage is also reduced. They include less radiological deterioration of joints. They improve the quality of life of patients who are at school and work, in the sense that they are able to stay at those activities. They are able to increase the physical activities of particularly the pediatric population, and of course the preservation of bone density. So there are many advantages of prophylaxis. We must just not forget that prophylaxis it's meant to help patients, but it also imposes a treatment burden, particularly if it is done with half-life products that are standard half-life products. Essentially, in these settings, one would expect the individual patients to inject themselves at least 2 to 3 times a week. And if one does the math, if the patient injects themselves religiously 3 times a week for a year, we are talking about 156 injections, and in a period of 20 years, we're talking about a large number of injections. So the burden of treatment imposed by prophylaxis is huge. I beg your pardon. One thought is that instead of injecting that frequently, we should be coming up with products that require less frequent injections. And that is the context in which, in fact, the extended half-life products were brought to the fore. In extending the half-life of clotting factors, there are a number of technologies that were explored, and I'll dwell only on the 2 that have had successful products formulated, and these are the fusion technologies and the pegylation technologies. In the fusion technologies, we have seen the FC fusion, the albumin fusion, and currently evolving is the CTP fusion. And I've listed there the products that have already have been taken through the phases of their clinical development programs, and some of them have already been published. In the same way, the pegylation technologies, there has been a differentiation in the pegylation in that some of the pegylation is site-directed, some of it is controlled pegylation, and some of it is glycopegylation. And I've listed there some of the products that have come out as a result of the clinical development programs in the pegylation technology approach. In the next couple of slides, I would like to summarize some of the results of the clinical development programs and the clinical trials involving the extended half-life factor 8 and factor 9 products. I'll start off with the most impressive, which is the recombinant factor 9 products. This is a summary of the half-life extension. You can see that, in fact, it's fairly impressive. We're talking about 2.4-fold to 4.8-fold extension of the half-life. Clearly a huge advantage of extended half-life factor 9. The extension of the half-life of the factor 8 product was less impressive, but nevertheless also extended. And the extension was 1.4 to 1.6-fold. So essentially, we're talking about improved products. The question then is, how can these products be used optimally in the global setting? It really depends on where you are, whether these products are available in your environment. And I've specifically picked up on two questions. To answer the question on how we can use these products, it really depends on the regimen that one is embarking on and choosing for the individual patients. But it also depends on the clinical settings, because these products are licensed for a variety of indications, which we'll explore later in the slides. If one explores the regimen approach, the old approach of one size fits all probably needs to be revisited by the global community of hemophilia. We need to start to recognize that patients are individuals, and certainly with improved pharmacokinetic properties of the extended half-life, this will enable us to be much more versatile in adapting to the patient's needs. And the one way of doing it is to adjust the dose and fix the dosing frequency and the trough level for a particular patient that clearly would fit into that category. We could also adjust the dosing frequency, but fix the dose and the trough level. The third regimental approach would be to fix the trough level and adjust the dose and the dosing frequency to be able to achieve that trough level. In some of the patients where clearly the risk of bleeding is very low, one would be able to fix all three parameters: the dose, the dosing frequency, and the trough level, understanding that, in fact, the patient will not be at risk of bleeding. So that is one approach these products can be used, is to be able to do individualized regimens that fit into the activities of the patients. If one looks at the various clinical settings that these products can be used on, there is a variety of them. Some of them can and are being used for the treatment of bleeds, for the prevention of bleeds. They are used in the perisurgical hemostatic evaluation of patients, and certainly they are used in the pediatric setup. And I'll summarize some of the results from the clinical trial, and I won't dwell too much into the details of each of the studies. Suffice to say that, in fact, by and large, if you start with the 4 recombinant factor 8 extended half-life products, you can see that, in fact, the hemostatic efficacy is very high. We're talking about the efficacies ranging from 90% to almost 98%. Quite impressive, and clearly that gives us the assurance that in the global setting, one should have the confidence of using these products for the treatment of bleeds. If one looks at the extended half-life factor 9 products, we are seeing a similar picture where the overall hemostatic efficacy ranges from 96 to 97%. Very impressive, and again, giving us the assurance that if we're to use these products, the expectation is that, in fact, they would work if we wanted to use them for the treatment of bleeds. What about the prevention of bleeds? If one looks at the extended half-life recombinant factor 8 products, these were the data from the 4 currently available extended half-life factor 8 product. You can see that the annualized bleeding rate is very very low, ranging from 1.3 in NHGP to 4.1 in the Bayer product. Very, very impressive impact on the prevention of bleeds, and a similar picture can be seen in recombinant factor 9 extended half-life. You can see that the annualized bleeding rate is quite low, ranging from 0 in some of the studies up to 3 in other studies. So clearly, if we're to use these products for the prevention of bleeds, the data seem to suggest and give us the assurance that in fact we'll be okay. We can expect very good results when these products are used. Perhaps the question that I ask myself when one is faced with this set of data is, what is the impact of the extended half-life product globally? Of course, that data currently probably does not exist, but I'm particularly interested in the kind of impact that one would expect in a product that has got a 90% efficacy or an annualized bleeding rate of 0, for example. I went to look at some of the data that is freely available. This is data from the WFH Annual Global Survey to see if the onset of the availability of extended half-life product had any impact, in fact, in the global data. You can see here, when one looks at the IU per capita, comparing the various economic settings around the world, that it's actually beginning to show the impact. From 2013, when some of these extended half-life products actually became available, you can see that in the high-income countries, the per capita usage increased. Whereas if one looks at the lower income countries, and certainly the lower middle income countries, there was absolutely no difference. Of course, this did not come as a surprise to some of us, because it links to the availability of these products to the low income countries and the low middle income countries. So essentially, what we would want to see is the change in that impact over time as the products become available in the low income and the low middle income countries. And in fact, in a subsequent analysis in the same survey, when the analysis was done per IU per patient rather than per capita, one is beginning to see a slightly different picture. Whereas in the high-income countries, it seemed to have leveled up. In fact, it doesn't matter how much product they are using, the units per patient seem to have stabilized. Whereas if one looks at the low-income countries and the lower middle-income countries, one is beginning to see actually potentially the increase in the usage. And that is good news. Essentially, it tells us that over time, one would expect that these extended half-life products may well have the desired impact that we are looking for in the global setting. Many of the developing countries referred to here as low-income and low-middle-income countries currently do not have access to the product. But what is noteworthy is that many of them actually are currently receiving extended half-life products via the humanitarian aid program of the WFH. And I've given you an example of the humanitarian aid program currently being supplied in Africa, and that is shown in purple here. Almost 90%, or you could say 99% of the countries in Africa are actually reliant on the humanitarian aid, and they are actually getting the extended half-life product. And it's a very important observation, because the next question that we should actually be asking is that if the resource-constrained countries actually do have access to the extended half-life products, how should they be using these products? And here I don't have data, I'm giving you my impression. I think the first consideration is that they should actually be targeting this product for use in the peri-surgical settings. We do know that, in fact, in the developing world, we are carrying the highest burden of musculoskeletal disease. We also know that the extended half-life products actually are effective in managing patients undergoing surgery. We also know from this study that we completed recently involving 8 developing countries to evaluate the musculoskeletal burden, that the majority of these countries in fact had a large musculoskeletal burden in the hemophilia population, both with or without inhibitors. In the light of that, the data from the clinical trial, when these products are used in the peri-surgical setting, is actually very encouraging. As you can see in this summary, whether you are using extended half-life factor 9 products or extended half-life factor 8 products such as recombinant factor 8 FC, it would seem, at least from the clinical trial, that one is looking at a 100% hemostatic response. In only very few instances where patients required an intraoperative dose of an extended half-life. So if one combines the high musculoskeletal burden that we see in resource-constrained environment to these results, my advice would be, in the global sense, where the countries are receiving these products, they should be focusing on using them for surgical purposes, because then the outcome and the impact will be greater than using them elsewhere. If one looks at the other setting where these products can be used in resource-constrained settings, my impression is that we should be targeting pediatric patients for a number of reasons. In part because the extended half-life clotting factor carry a reduced treatment burden with the reduced frequency of injections, particularly in this particular population, which is difficult to manage. But also, we've got clinical trial data that shows that these products are actually safe and efficacious in the pediatric group, as shown in this slide in a number of pediatric trials involving patients that were 12 years or younger. You can see that, in fact, the overall ABRs were very low. We're talking between 0 and 2%, at least in one of the studies, and up to 4% in other analysis. If one looks at the extended half-life factor 9 product used in the pediatric setting, we are seeing similar results with ABRs of between 1 and 2. So my impression is that we should be targeting the pediatric group in the global sense if we're to use these products with a huge impact expected, because these products seem to be very protective in many ways. Prophylaxis per se is not the beginning and the end of it all. We do know that even patients that have optimal prophylaxis still experience bleeds, still experience subclinical bleeds, and this was alluded to by the Mahlangu-Johnson study, which predates the extended half-life products, but there's been some subsequent studies that indicated indirectly, for example, the deposition of hemosiderin in some of the studies. Patients who have never had a bleed but have hemosiderin deposition clearly indicate to us that those patients must have had subclinical bleeds. And in fact, this data is further validated in other studies. So this is some of the limitations of having extended half-life products that one has to recognize and accept that, in fact, we do need better products after all. In summary and in conclusion, I hope I have shared with you the fact that the extended half-lives were developed in part to mitigate against the high treatment burden imposed by prophylaxis, which we accept as the current standard of care. I've also shown you that the extended half-life products, in particular the extended half-life factor 9, have a better pharmacokinetic property in comparison to factor 8. In the context of adolescents and adults, the extended half-life products are clearly showing high efficacies in both the prevention of bleeds but also in the treatment of bleeds. And of course, some of these studies are ongoing in the pediatric settings. And my impression is that in a resource-constrained setting, the extended half-life products will need to be carefully used to maximize their impact. And I think that they should be used in the peri-surgical setting as well as in the pediatric populations where we would expect better results. And of course, with these current limitations of extended half-life products, including the subclinical bleeds and some of the patients frankly bleeding, the fact that the extended half-life products are actually replacement therapies which are associated with immunogenicity, we'll have to look very carefully to explore other therapies such as non-replacement therapies. And I'm pleased to hear that, in fact, the next presentation is going to be on non-replacement therapies. Thank you for your attention.